Julia opened her eyes in a panic. Behind Kate stood the rest of the family. They had crept silently into the cabin, the dim light casting shadows that obscured their eyes. Julia withdrew her hands and stared at the table. She wondered whether she could steal a horse. The family watched her closely. In his hand, Pa Bender gripped something that glinted unnaturally in the light. She excused herself again and felt for the frame of the door. When Kate moved toward her, Julia shot out into the darkness. The black gulf of the prairie opened up before her as she ran. A single gunshot tore a hole in the night sky as she fled. Julia dropped to the ground. A mixture of German and English rang out as the family cursed at one another. She started to crawl, chest tightening against the cold in the waterlogged soil. Rustling in the grass replaced the shouting, and when she checked again, Kate's lamplight danced in the air like an insect. Julia felt for imperfections in the ground where she could hide, but she knew she had to run. Gebhardt stalked the landscape, bemoaning the delight Kate took in frightening people who thought they were her friend. When he found the flattened grass, Julia was already running. The Benders watched in silence as she dissolved into an indistinguishable shadow. They returned to the cabin. Kate smothered the flame of the candle between her fingertips and snapped at the men for not being fast enough. Behind the curtain, the flies had found their way beneath the floorboards. Hi, I'm Dan. Since our video about the Bloody Benders came out, Hell's Half Acre, the untold story of the Benders, a serial killer family on the American frontier, was released, and I absolutely devoured it. By the way, if you haven't watched our episode on the Bloody Benders, I'd highly suggest doing so. It's linked up there now. The book is full of novelistic passages like the one I just read that were absolutely terrifying, while also being an extremely well-researched dive into the case. We reached out to Susan Jonusas to talk about the book, and she was incredibly generous with her time. She spent a morning talking with us from across the Atlantic. Because of this book and our fascination with the case, I didn't feel done with the Bloody Benders yet. So my wife and I decided to take a trip to Cherryvale, Kansas, where the Benders lived and farmed and killed. First, some corrections. Our video was researched through a few books and the internet, but Susan Jonusas was able to dig a lot deeper than we were able to, as you would probably expect from someone with a book deal. So here are some of the things we want to correct or amend from our video. Let's start with the identity of the family. It seems unlikely that the Benders were an actual family. John Jr. and Kate were probably husband and wife, as Ma and Pa probably were, but it's unclear if Kate was actually Ma's daughter, and it seems very unlikely that John Jr. was related. The younger John's actual name was probably John Gebhardt. It doesn't seem like there is any evidence at all that Ma Bender's name was Elvira. Jonusas just calls her Ma throughout the book, and I can't find anywhere else that's a reliable source for that being her name. The best hypothesis that I could come up with was that it's just a corruption of the name Almira Monroe, who was a suspect along with her daughter, Sarah Davis. We covered that theory that the Bender women were living in Michigan a few decades later and were even brought back to Kansas for a trial. But Hell's Half Acre makes it pretty clear this was circumstantial. Almira Griffith might have physically resembled Ma Bender, but it looks to me like Leroy Dick, one of Cherryvale's chief investigators into the crime, was using some wishful thinking in his investigation. The Griffith trial looks unquestioningly like a sham. It was full of specious claims and was spearheaded by a phenomenally interesting woman named Frances E. McCann, whose dedication to the case, as misguided as it was, earned her the nickname the Little Detective, which graces her gravestone. She strongly believed that Sarah Davis was Kate Bender because of spirits and dreams and nonsense like that. Still, her section of the story was something we didn't come across in our original research, and it was delightful. Additionally magnified in Hell's Half Acre was the role of Alexander York, whose brother William was the most prominent victim of the Benders. Alexander York spent decades of his life trying to find the Benders. He personally tracked them for a while after the discovery of William's body, and he felt partially responsible for the Benders escaping, since he wasn't able to hunt them down. We mentioned in our video that the Benders suspiciously declined to offer the town to search their property for bodies when at a meeting in the Harmony Grove schoolhouse, but that had to have been fabricated, because the Benders were long gone by that meeting. It appears that they left Kansas 4 days prior, stopping overnight in Chanute, Kansas, before boarding a train in Thayer. They were easily identified due to their unusual and frankly gruesome suitcase, which was covered in dog hide. The station agent remembered the luggage clearly. My biggest pleasure when reading the book was following the trail that Jonusas was able to track from Cherryvale. We weren't able to find any evidence that the Benders split up when leaving Labette County and then later reunited in Texas, but that's exactly what happened. The criminals joined up with some horse thieves and spent some time in the Chickasaw Nation, south of Kansas and Colorado. The closest the Benders may have come to capture was when an amateur detective named James Sullivan of Los Animas, Colorado, tracked them to their gang hideout, and even corresponded with their outlaw acquaintance, Missouri Bill. Sullivan met with Leroy Dick about the case several times. Sullivan was probably killed by Missouri Bill in Texas under the pretext of taking him to find the Benders. In fact, I think the most likely place that John Gebhardt lived out the rest of his life was in Los Animas, where he rustled cattle with a friend named Frank McPherson. Before we go visit those places, let's sit with Susan for a bit and talk to her about the case. She's the expert, and she was great to talk to.
So my name is Susan Jonusas, and I am the author of Half Acre, the untold story of the Benders, a serial killer family on the American frontier. And I started writing this book shortly after I completed my master's at King's College in London, where I wrote a dissertation that focused on the criminal, and specifically the female criminal, in 19th century popular culture. And the Benders is a topic I've been interested in for a long time, and I finally felt like I was equipped to kind of pursue it and find out more.
So I want to ask you your opinion on about a couple of things as kind of the expert here. So for motive, for the Benders' motive, how much do you think was money? How much do you think, like you said, like a cat playing with its food, how much of it was just like fucking with people? How much was they just have this urge to kill, a la Ted Bundy or something? Like, what do you think the motive was?
So I think you're looking at essentially a combination of motives. I think you're looking at the more I looked into it, the more I felt like they were primarily after horses. Lots of the people who not all of them, some of them genuinely do have really nothing of value on them, or items of value are found on the bodies, which implies sort of a crime, a murder for the purpose of committing a murder because you enjoy it. But actually a lot of the people do have horses, and a lot of the horses are described as being particularly nice horses. We know obviously William York was on a nice horse. I think Benjamin Brown was on a nice horse. George Lonker had a team of horses, and horses on the frontier were a really useful, important form of currency. And that's obviously what Missouri Bill and Samuel Merrick were involved in doing, was stealing horses. So I think you're looking at criminals who realized they could take advantage of a very specific time and place. But you're also looking at somebody in the family who does just like to murder.
Do you think that was Kate?
Well, this is the thing. I think that Kate probably really enjoyed the manipulation aspect. I think that she probably didn't really care too much about the murders being committed. I think she was quite a greedy woman. She liked money, she liked goods. She obviously resented having to live on the frontier a bit. She wanted to be famous, she wanted nice clothes, all of that kind of stuff. For me personally, I feel like it's probably Gebhardt. So that's John Jr. I think he was probably the murderer of the family.
At least in the early parts of your book, it seemed like they were a lot more just in it for the money and in it for the horses. You give that account of them taking this old couple on a walk, and at Ma, I'm kind of faking a hacking something up, and when they get back, all their goods are gone. So yeah, that seemed to be a lot more like they're criminals who will kill for it and don't really care, but they're not like the deranged psychos killing for fun that a lot of things have painted them as. Although it's still a pretty gruesome method of killing, I would say.
Oh yeah, and I think there's also probably an element that they realized they could just do it on the open frontier, that people did just disappear, and it wasn't initially thought of as that unusual. I mean, if you're committing crimes in a city, they'll be very different to how you commit it in the middle of nowhere, where people routinely go missing because of weather or bandits or whatever reason.
And it seemed like they
And
were taking advantage of the Osage tribe too. Like they could just kind of blame it on the Osage people.
exactly. So there is this idea that you could just blame violence on quote unquote Indian raiders. That's obviously, you see that in Laura Ingalls Wilder's work, the idea of like the threat from the indigenous people. And then I thought it's really interesting the way all of that works in Indian territory as well. Obviously, Samuel Merrick is arrested by a black man who's working for law enforcement and two indigenous people. And then the Benders themselves and the outlaw gang are a real mixture of white people, black people, indigenous people, who are all kind of working together to stay outside of the parameter of the military.
Sure. Yeah, I found that really interesting. So as far as Frances McCann's quest, she was maybe my favorite character in the book that I didn't know about previously. She was adorable, but also like obviously just has this kind of weird bone to pick with people. And like, so I kind of got the sense reading your writing that you felt like she was just completely off base, that the Griffiths were absolutely not the Benders, even though you never give a definitive, like, they were not the Benders kind of answer. I got the sense that you felt like, nah, that this is all bunk.
Yeah, I mean, I think Frances McCann is absolutely fascinating, like as a woman and as a kind of like her life. Because I think she's potentially someone who was very traumatized as a child. She was obviously an orphan. She is obsessed with this idea that her father was murdered, even though I dug and dug and dug and dug and dug and like couldn't really find any evidence of like a crime like that being committed in relation to her. But also that's not to say it didn't happen, because obviously she moved around a lot. That might not even have been the initial name that she had. That's all very complicated. But the kind of weirdness of the circumstances through which she decides that Sarah, who's working essentially as a maid for her, is the Bender, is Kate Bender, was just so bizarre to me, because she obviously talks about how she had a dream where she sees the murder of her father, and then Sarah's there, and then another woman's there, and she wakes up and she's like, oh, she must be the Bender.
I had to read that part twice. I was like, what? Like this was a dream?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's so confusing to read when you read like her accounts and the interviews she gives to the papers, and you're really like, what? What? And then you have kind of Leroy Dick's version, which is that Sarah gets really ill in a fever, she confesses to the crimes. So you've got these, whatever the circumstances of this were, Frances obviously becomes completely obsessed with this and essentially stalks this woman, follows her back to Michigan, where she spends a lot of time kind of surveilling Sarah and her mother, and just becomes totally convinced that they're the Benders.
On that same note, so Leroy Dick looks at this picture of Almira Griffith, and you say in the book, goes, "That's Ma Bender." He calls it out. Do you think he was just like she looked like it in that one photo, and after that he was just trying to chase it because he just needed like some kind of closure to this story? It seemed kind of like he got away from himself a little bit in that tangent.
So he's not over the years, various tintypes appear of the Benders. There's actually a picture of an really old, amazing looking old man at the Kansas Archives, who is sent to the governor like, is this Pa Bender? And I looked at the picture and I was just like, oh my god, maybe this is the picture. And then you look into it and you're like, it is absolutely not. That is just some random old man.
Yeah.
But he's not the only person over the years to identify a member of the family from a photograph. And I think that he had a lot of guilt about not acting on disappearances in the area maybe as quickly as he should have.
Yeah.
I think obviously this is a hugely traumatic experience for a community that never got any closure. And at that point in time, he was a leading figure in that community. He remained a leading figure in that community his whole life. And you see this kind of in the 20s and the 30s, you see this relationship between younger generations and the initial settlers, and that kind of mythologization of those initial settlers. and his storytelling very much kind of plays a big part in that. And I think he probably thought, this is the chance that I have to get them. Like, I can make it right. That woman looks enough like Ma Bender looked, for me to identify her. I mean, one of the things I found really interesting at the pre-hearing is that it devolves into a big argument about what these women even look like. You know, nobody is quite sure how tall Kate was, what Ma Bender actually sounded like, whether Kate even had red hair, you know, all of this kind of stuff. And I think these days we think, well, how can you not recognize someone?
There'd been an interval of about 15 years, though, right? This was like the mid-1880s.
Yeah, so it's 1889, I think, that they're arrested. It's a long time.
Yeah.
So both those women, I mean, Kate and Mark Bender would have looked very different anyway, especially if they'd been living on the open frontier. And I think, obviously, you know, there's this thing like Kate has a scar on her face, and Maurice Sparks says Sarah's got a scar on her face too. And I think it's things like that where you think, oh, well, maybe it is them. And then you look at the people who are testifying, like Rudolph Brockman on the stand. They give very distinct descriptions of the Benders because they interacted with them a lot more. And he says, no, you know, these are not the same people. But I think, you know, I was surprised how split the community was. I would have thought that they'd all be like, yeah, let's get them finally. But actually, a lot of people were really horrified by the way that these women were treated.
Yeah, I was just surprised at how it seemed like they were so grasping at straws there. And I was surprised in your writing about how many people were like, well, this person testified, and then it later came out that they had never met the Benders, or they had only seen them one time or something like that.
Yeah, like 200 meters away.
Yeah, this would never stand up in court today, I don't think. But yeah, that was strange. Do you feel like, I feel like the fascination with those two, as well as with Kate and with Ma Bender, kind of has this sort of like misogynistic vibe to it. The fact you mentioned like sex work and things like that. Do you feel like a lot of that was just like villainizing women, or am I off base?
Yeah, I think especially with, I think you've got different things going on. I think Kate, this idea that like a young, sexy woman was complicit in these murders is a kind of, it's like the ultimate taboo. I talk in the book about how women during that period were supposed to be a very specific way. And she just was everything that wasn't that. And she's also obviously complicit in the murder of a child, which again is kind of, we feel very differently about women who commit crimes against children than we do about men, just because of the maternal elements.
Sure.
So I think with her, it's essentially kind of like a weird erotic fascination you get with Kate, which you see in Robert Adelman's book, The Bloody Benders, which is a very erotic book, for lack of a better word. It's all about her sexual relationships with men in the area. And her also, like, obviously her role in the crimes and how she was treated, but it's very focused on her as an object of desire. Whereas with these other women, it's very much like they're poor, they're unattractive, they've got loads of children, they've been married, you know, sort of 6, 7, 8 times. Almira has a great quote where she's like, I don't even remember how many times I've been married. And also this kind of like belligerence on the stand as well that they both have in Michigan. They lose it a bit when they move to Labette, and I think they realize like, oh, we're in real trouble here. But also their willingness to accuse each other. I think people thought they were uneducated, shrill, kind of just horrible women. And also the town that they were from, I think, didn't really like them at all. And there is definitely an element, I think, of misogyny, just like, you're not behaving how a woman should behave.
Yeah.
So, and you're also not, you've not got this kind of sexual element because you're, you know, not conventionally attractive, or you're an older woman, or you are a woman who like wears how difficult her life has been on her face.
Yeah.
But I thought it was also, I mean, what happens to both of them afterwards is just awful as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's just that idea of the tree, which we still see now. I mean, I found when I was reading the book, you know, it took William York disappearing for an actual investigation to kick off.
Yeah.
Just like these women had no real way of defending themselves. They were a really easy target. You know, they were accused by essentially a merchant class woman and her maids.
Yeah.
So they don't really have a leg to stand on.
Yeah. I felt like that had to be a part of it, especially with like the story of like Reed from earlier. Like there's kind of this, well, fellas on the prairie, you might get lucky, but you also might be murdered or something. Like,
yeah,
it's got to be part of the fascination.
Yeah, exactly. And this whole idea that, you know, she's into spiritualism, which sort of pushes at the boundaries of respectability a bit. And she talks about free love, which obviously means something a bit different back then, but it still has that kind of like glitzy vibe to it.
Yeah.
And I think it's so easy to make Kate into this essentially femme fatale.
Yeah.
Like that's what she feels like, the way that people write about her.
So on that note of like where they ended up after the crimes, it kind of seems like maybe Gebhardt ends up continuing to fence horses in like the Los Animas area. Is that where you generally think might be the best guess for where he ends the rest of his life?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I found really interesting was looking at the movement of Frank McPherson, who obviously was involved with the family, and he goes all over the West. He's in New Mexico, he's in Utah, he's in Colorado. We know obviously they were in Colorado because Sullivan reports them being in Colorado.
Mm-hmm.
So do various other people involved in the search. And I think probably the older and the younger couple split. I can't imagine that the older couple would have stayed on the open frontier for an extended period of time. It's just really hard living.
Sure.
And I think Colorado at that point in time is obviously, there's so many mining towns. It's almost even easier to hide than it is in Labette County because there's so many people coming through. Things are being put up and torn down overnight. And there's a certain level of kind of violence in these areas anyway.
Yeah.
And so my feeling is probably that they went somewhere in Colorado. And the younger couple, that is Kate and Gebhardt, because I think she probably would have followed him. I mean, I think that they were common law married. I
Sure.
don't think that they were brother and sister. Just from the way that they interact with each other, the way people describe it.
Mm-hmm.
And Alexander York says that he thinks that they were probably killed by their own band of outlaws. I think that's also perfectly possible, to be honest with you. I think probably if they were involved if they were murdered by someone else, those people might not have even known who they were.
Sure.
You know, it's highly unlikely that they would have gone around talking about their crimes to everybody.
Okay, so the younger Benders probably end up in Colorado. Any idea where the older two end up?
I mean, there's a whole kind of string where they report that Pa is a man called John Flickinger.
Right.
Who commits suicide and then his head ends up on a bar somewhere. Like that's a kind of weird bit of Bender law.
Around the Great Lakes, right? Like Lake Michigan?
Yes, exactly, Lake Michigan. And that's another thing that you can't really verify. I mean, it turns out that Elmira, so she, again, I think Flickinger comes from the fact that Elmira was married to a German man with the surname Flickinger. But again, if she's not Ma Bender, there's no reason why he would be Bar Bender. Yeah. And I think, you know, I mean, I imagine that they probably just moved into a little settlement somewhere and just kind of kept on the down low, to be honest. They obviously like weren't that friendly as people. They weren't as kind of entrepreneurial as the younger couple. I think of both couples, I feel like they potentially would have reintegrated better, having been separate. Because, you know, when you read about all these towns, there's always kind of older people keeping to themselves, which is obviously a very easy thing to do. Or they could have just, you know, set up a homestead themselves, not killed anybody on it.
Sure.
Or maybe they did. We'll never know. You know, I think. Yeah,
it's hard to tell, like, if it's just a random killing or if it was the Benders. I think that's a fun part of the myth. Since you went to the Cherryvale Museum, and I thought it was hilarious that I was messaging you on Twitter while I was standing in the Cherryvale Museum. That was fun for me. I wanted to ask about 2 items in the museum. Do you think the hammers that they have are legit? Because I've seen a couple of places claim to have them, and I'm sort of inclined to be like, yeah, I think these are the hammers that Leroy Dick pulled from under the stove. And the photographs that they have there that might be John and Kate, I've never seen those anywhere else, and I was wondering what you thought if those were those 2 articles were the genuine article.
So I definitely think the hammers are 100%. I mean, I guess there's a possibility that they're just some old hammers. But I felt like if they're anywhere, this is where they're going to be. Obviously, you can sort of trace the passage of the hammers to the museum as well. With regards to the photo, I had kind of a conversation with Mike about this, because I think Harold Schechter wrote a book called Little Slaughterhouse on the Prairie about the Benders, which is like a shorter kind of look. But in that picture, if I'm right, is included as a picture of them. And I remember reading that and thinking, where's that from? Like, what is that? And then obviously we went to the museum and it was there. I think it's one of those things, like, honestly, it could be, but it could also be a picture that was bought in an antique shop.
Yeah.
I think I don't think it's them, to be honest with you. That's my gut reaction. But sort of, if you ask me to provide concrete evidence why it's not them, I couldn't really.
Sure.
But I think, there's no, because it arrived in a Bible, didn't it? I think that's how they got hold of it.
Yeah.
Someone brought a Bible in and the picture was in it, and it was like, this is John and Kate.
Yeah, and there's also pictures of their great grandmother as a baby or something like that with it. I don't know.
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, it could be them, but it also could not be them. I think when we were talking about kind of the visual elements of the book, I didn't really want any illustrations of the family themselves. For me, it was more important that we have the governor's proclamation, because I think that's the best evidence we have of what they look like, basically. It's the descriptions are not kind of weird and overblown. They're very specific. They're very direct. And I just felt like because the pictures you see a lot are from the Benders in Kansas. Those kind of sketches. Yeah. And that's a book from, I think, 1913. And I think, like, they're nice sketches. Obviously, we like to put a face on people like that. That's a big part of interesting criminals, is looking at the criminal and going, that person looks like a criminal. Yeah. And then, or, oh my God, that person doesn't look like a criminal. But for me, I felt like any kind of photograph that alluded to them being the actual members of the family, I didn't really want to include.
Sure.
Because I didn't feel like I could verify it, basically.
My wife and I made our way to southeastern Kansas and stayed in Independence for the weekend, which was a really nice little town. Honestly, most of the US is sleeping on Kansas and the rest of so-called flyover country. It wasn't very green yet since we were there right at the beginning of spring, but most fields had some really pretty purple dead nettle flowers growing in them. It's a beautiful place. We spent the day in Cherryvale, which is just a few minutes from Independence, and checked out as many locations from the Benders story as we could. We drove over the Verdigris River, that some people claimed was the final resting place of the Bender family. We stopped by Drum Creek, where the first bodies were discovered. We passed through Chanute, Kansas, which the Benders stopped in overnight when fleeing Labatt County, and it's where my grandmother was born. And of course, we headed to the Bender Mounds. Expecting to find the historical marker, we accidentally drove onto the property, which is still just some person's house, so we felt awful about that. The historical marker is a mile or so away, and the maps don't do a great job of making that clear. It's tough to get super close to the mounds, especially to the center, where it seems the cabin probably stood, so the best we could do is take my drone up from the highway and hope that nobody shot it down over their farm. Susan Jonusas writes that the cabin would be lost against the barren hills if it was built at the lowest point in the depression, so it's probably not visible from off the property. After visiting the Bender Mounds, we made an appointment with the Cherryvale Museum to see some of their artifacts, and it was such a wonderful place. A lovely woman named Rita showed us around and told us everything she knew about Cherryvale's famous residents, including the Benders. The Bender room in the back contains what they claim to be the Bender hammers, and I'm actually inclined to believe that they're the real article. A couple of places claim to have the murder weapons, but these seem to come straight from the family of Township Officer Leroy Dick, who allegedly put them straight into his saddlebag after finding them shoved under the stove in the Bender cabin. The museum has some artifacts that are reportedly from the cabin, as well as a wealth of newspaper clippings following the growing legend over the last century and a half. They also have pictures that I haven't found anywhere else that could be actual photos of the Benders. It's hard to tell for sure, but one can hope, and they certainly fit the physical descriptions of the younger Benders. The museum was a wealth of even more stories about the Benders, and it seems that every single person in Cherryvale has had a story about how their great-great-granddaddy killed the Benders himself. Just like searching online, a visit to the museum sort of obscures as much as it illuminates, because it continues to add more accounts and stories to the pile, and they certainly do not all fit together. On our way home from Kansas, we stopped in Los Animas, Colorado, just a few miles from Bent's Fort, which you may remember from our Sand Creek video, and it's just a ways away from our family's farms. It seems like there's a good a chance as any that John Gebhard lived the rest of his life here in Los Animas, since they were well known to have fenced stolen horses here. I even did a grave search to find if he was perhaps buried under an alias. I couldn't find any of the names that they might have used, but there are quite a few Johns buried in that cemetery with unknown origins, so who knows? Back in Denver, my friend James and I took a trip down to Fairmount Cemetery to visit the grave of Alexander York, who lived the rest of his life in Denver after losing the trail of the Benders and seemingly last commenting on the case in the 1880s. While there, we stopped by another grave that happened to be nearby, known murderer and huge piece of shit, John Milton Shivington, who was the perpetrator of the Sand Creek Massacre. Our episode on it that we made last year is honestly my favorite thing that we put out, so you should give it a look-see if you haven't. We would like to thank Susan Jonusas for talking with us and for writing such a great book. Sorry we mispronounced your name through the whole previous video. Thanks to the Cherryvale Museum for opening up just for us, and for Rita for spending the afternoon with us there. And thanks to you. Yeah, you. If you're still here, thanks for being awesome and watching. Please consider doing the things that show YouTube that you like this video, such as liking and subscribing. You're the people who make doing this YouTube channel fun. See you next month.